So, I've been having some things on my mind that I've really been thinking about and I wanted to talk about for quite some time. But sometimes, as we all know, life can get in the way of things. And it's been a long road, it's been a long journey. But I wanted to talk about how I ended up in Russia, what I experienced there, and coming back to the United States after my visit, how I've changed and how my life has changed. And I guess where it all starts is, I suppose I should let you know, I was actually born in Moscow, Russia in 1985. And I don't remember a whole lot about my time there because it was a long time ago and I was young. But I lived there for a period of about 5 years up until I was brought over. My family immigrated over to the United States. It was a long story. I remember this was the early 1990s. As you guys may or may not know, there were a lot of changes happening in Russia. There was almost a sort of a revolution. At that time, if I'm not mistaken, I believe Boris Yeltsin was actually the president of the USSR. And this was before it was formally known as Russia. So I was technically born in the Soviet Union. I had my grandmother, my grandfather, my mom, who was at the time separated from my father, and I also had a brother, have a brother younger than me by a year. And so I was living there in Moscow, and I had even started school. And one day I remember, as far back as I can remember, my mom and my grandparents packing all of their belongings, packing all of their things, selling everything that they owned, packing a bunch of suitcases. And at the time, it was weird to me because I was young and I didn't really know what was happening. All I remember was my grandparents and my mom saying that we were going to America. And of course, being a young man at that time with no real experience of the world yet, just kind of starting to comprehend and understand things as a kid, I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know what America was. At that time, I couldn't imagine my life being anywhere else other than where it was, where I was living. My environment was my surroundings. It was the apartment that we had lived in. It was the summers that we had spent with my grandparents by the lake or around Moscow, or going to the Red Square, to the Kremlin, or going to visit family, friends, or relatives at a dacha. Some of you may know dacha is a place. It's almost like a vacation home that many Russians culturally, traditionally have living in Russia. And so, to touch on a little bit more, my mom at the time, as I mentioned, was basically estranged or separated from my father. And this was for various reasons that I'll touch on more later on in time, maybe in a different video. But my mother was a very, I would say, abusive person, both physically, mentally, emotionally. And I remember my brother and I, we were scared of our mother. We were frightened. But when this whole thing was happening, I remember one day the TV was on, and we were watching. My brother and I, we were sitting down in the living room and watching tanks, military tanks, rolling up to in the Kremlin, to the Red Square, with cannons and pointed towards the Capitol buildings. And so I was watching all of this going on, and at the same time, simultaneously, my family was scattering to pack all of their belongings, pack all of their stuff, so that we can move. And within a short period of time, we got in an airplane and we flew to America. I remember the flight almost as if it was yesterday. I remember even being on the airplane with my brother and one of the flight attendants giving us like a little badge, and we flew on Delta Airlines. I remember this. And so they gave us this lady, this flight attendant, she gave us this Delta badge that they had, and they gave it to us because I guess they thought, we were cute or whatever it was. We've never been on an airplane before. And so we landed in the United States. It was a very long flight. What it seemed like at that time, it seemed like forever. And at that time, I still didn't really have any orientation about where I was or what was happening. All I remember was my my mom's sisters, my aunts and uncle picking us up from the airport, and we had landed in New York. And so they had drove us to their home in Staten Island, where we lived for a period of months, trying to get adjusted, for my mom to have enough time to find an apartment, as well as an apartment for my parents where we can all live, so that we didn't have to stay with my aunts and uncles for an indefinite period. So I believe we stayed there for a period of 4 to 6 months, and my mom and my grandparents managed to find an apartment, small apartments, 2 apartments in Brooklyn, one for them, for my grandparents, and one for myself and my brother and my mom. And so we ended up moving to the borough of Brooklyn, and that's essentially where we grew up. At the time, I began asking a lot more questions about my father, because during that time, as I was growing up, I was estranged from him. I had no contact with him. I, at that time, didn't even know his name. As the years went on and time started to pass, I couldn't remember what he looked like or what he was about. And being that my mom suffered from mental illness and things like that, she couldn't keep a job, couldn't really hold things down. My grandparents were supporting my mother, and in turn, they were supporting myself and my brother. We were little kids. We had started school. It didn't take us that long to learn English. I believe it only took about a summer for us to learn the English language from scratch, from zero. And we had started elementary school, public school, in Brooklyn. And, as time went on, I began to ask more and more questions about my father and just various information, like, where's my dad? And of course, our mom didn't really react well to that. It was always some sort of a altercation or some sort of verbal punishment or physical punishment. She was an unstable woman. She was very abusive. And so, of course, my brother and I just kind of felt like this is all just a normal part of life. We didn't know that it's not normal, or you're not supposed to abuse your children. You're not supposed to get beaten and all this other stuff that was happening to myself and my brother through the years, especially when we were little. So we had began public school, and I began, as I said, to ask more questions about my dad to my mom, and that was never met with anything positive. And so over the years, I began to understand, that if I bring up his name, it would make her uncomfortable, and it would basically just make her lash out at myself and my brother. And so it's just kind of a thing that went on unmentioned. And I remember growing up, and there were times when I was a small child, laying in bed at night, waiting to fall asleep, school in the morning, and I was just thinking about my old life, my life in Russia, and my father. And I remember especially it was hard when certain occasions would come around, holidays, especially birthdays, and I would wonder if my father would ever show up and kind of almost rescue us from the situation that was happening, because we were growing up. We were living in this tiny little apartment, which was a complete mess. It was falling apart. My mom was also a hoarder, so she would accumulate all kinds of things. She would order stuff. This was before we had iPhones and all this stuff, so we had the home shopping network, and she would order all kinds of stuff that she didn't need, that would just build up and accumulate. We had cockroaches and mice and rats, and we were living in this building, this old building, and we lived on the 2nd floor, and my grandfather, they lived on the 3rd. They lived on the floor above us. They weren't too far away whenever we needed them. Whenever we needed someone to take us out to the park, my mom wasn't capable of doing it. She could barely hold down a job. She laid around in bed most of the time, basically not functioning, kind of barely meeting our basic needs. And so my grandparents did a lot of the heavy lifting, a lot of the legwork when it came to my brother and I. And so how did I end up in Russia? Well, fast forward to a few years later. I was a little older. I'm a teenager now. And I joined the military shortly after the attacks of 9/11. So I spent some time in the U.S. Army. And during that time, there was a big change for me. This is the first time I was, I was leaving my home and became a person that was on his own. So this was kind of my transition into becoming a man. So I served 3 years in the U.S. Army from a period of 2003 to the end of 2005. And, I had a deployment under my belt. We deployed to Afghanistan in 2005. And I remember when I returned home from there, I came back to New York City after I was released from the military. And, I stayed with my mom for a period of about a few months, and things really did not go well. So I left. And I didn't have any friends or any family to turn to at that time, or at least I felt like I couldn't turn to them, because essentially my mom, through all the years of us growing up, had estranged us from everyone. So long story short, my life was kind of falling apart. I didn't have any purpose or direction. Here I was, a guy who just spent, some time in the military, who felt confident about himself, who had a meaning, had a purpose, had a brotherhood, had friendships, and all of a sudden it was just nothing. And so, I turned to a lot of different things at that time to try to cope and deal with the numbness and the pain that I was in. And eventually, it took some time, but eventually, after some years, I met my girlfriend, now my current wife, and we ended up getting an apartment together, moved in together, and we've been together now for the better part of the last 17 years. In 2017, things were going well. We had a little bit of money saved. My wife was working. I was working different jobs. I was cutting hair as a barber and working different side hustles to save money, make ends meet. We saved up some money, and my wife got pregnant in 2017. At that time, we were still living in Brooklyn. We had our own apartment, and we decided that knowing that there was a baby on the way, and the things at that time that were happening in New York, I didn't want to have, I didn't want us to have to raise a child in New York City, because the values that were or lack of values and the things that were happening in the city was just not something that I wanted to expose my daughter to, especially with the public school systems and things that were failing over there, and things just weren't headed into the right direction. So in 2017, as my wife was pregnant, we decided to move, and we picked Florida. So we flew out to Florida, found a place to live, got our apartment here, moved everything over, moved all of our stuff. Essentially, my wife, 6 months pregnant, I remember renting a U-Haul and packing all of our belongings and driving down to Florida for about 14 hours or whatever it was. It was quite a drive. And so our baby was born, our daughter. One of the best moments of my life, I could say honestly. I was there during the delivery and during her birth, and I got to experience that whole thing, and it was profound, to say the least. Never in my wildest dreams that I think I would become a dad, nor did I really want to be one. Being that I didn't have a father figure in my life and a very abusive mother, I didn't really experience what love was, what familial love was, in terms of how a mother is supposed to love her son and how you're supposed to feel safe and secure with your parents. I didn't have that. So part of my identity was lost because of it, and I struggled throughout my 20s for many, many years to try to come to terms with that. And so after my daughter was born, some time went on. COVID happened, the whole thing there. And one day I get a text message from my brother. And he texts me, and at this point, me and him, we don't really talk a lot, where it's not that we're estranged, but, he's got his life, I got my life, and we're not very close. I'll touch more on that for in a different time, in a different video. But we're not really close, but we maintain contact. And he shoots me a text. I open my phone, and it says, "Here's your father's number. This is our dad. Reach out to him." Apparently, he was already in touch with him at that point. That came as a shock to me. I remember sitting there for a period of a week, my hands shaking, trembling, just thinking to myself, all these years, what the hell am I going to say to this guy? He doesn't know me. He doesn't know the hell that I've been through. I wonder if he knows anything. And I had so many things and so many questions, but at that time I was filled with rage. I was filled with anger, and I was filled with a lot of hate towards him, because all those years of my development, all those crucial times where I needed him, all those years of birthdays and holidays and Christmases and New Year's, he wasn't there. And if you remember earlier in the video, I mentioned how there were times as a kid that I laid awake at night crying, wondering when my dad was going to come essentially to my rescue and fix the situation, straighten things out with my mother, and maybe put us on a better path. That never happened. And so, after some time, I stopped thinking about him. And so when this whole incident happened, I couldn't believe it. I was in shock. So finally, after about a week, I worked up the courage to contact him. And I remember I wrote a letter to him about 5 or 6 pages long, with all the things that I felt I wanted to say to him for so many years, but couldn't. And so I confronted him, not caring what kind of response was going to be given to me. And essentially, after pouring my heart out to him, finding out that he still lives in Moscow, Russia, he's still alive. He's 75 years old. Well, at the time he was 72 or 73. We began to talk. We began to communicate and get to know one another. And so at that time, this was around 2021, my younger brother, had arranged a trip to Russia to go meet him. And so I began working on my documents so that I could go ahead and take the trip there as well, and meet up with my father, see him face to face for the first time. I did that. I got my documentation. I found out that through birth, I managed to retain my Russian citizenship, and it was a long process. It was pretty arduous. It was very costly, but long story short, I ended up getting a Russian passport. This was right around the time where my brother had already flown there, and I decided to book plane tickets and fly out there to meet my father. And so I remember my first trip to Moscow. I remember sitting on that airplane and just being nervous and scared as hell, because I've been to other countries before at this point. Prior to this, I've served in the military. I was stationed overseas, and so, but this was a whole new thing for me. This was a whole new ball game. This was a country that really, aside from being born there, I felt like I had no connection to, as far as in terms of any family members there, because prior to this, I thought, I was told all kinds of stories, and I've overheard as a kid lots of things about my father. And at this point, basically, I figured either he wasn't alive anymore, or he was dead. And so up until I found out that he was actually alive, and I made plans and arrangements to meet him. All of this was going through my mind for many years as I was forming into an adult. And so sitting on that airplane, thinking about all the various possibilities, how the things was going to go. I mean, seeing my dad in person, face to face for the first time, having the ability to hug him and to sit down with him and to have a drink with him, and all of this was pretty overwhelming. So I landed in Russia in the spring of 2021. My brother actually had came to meet me at the airport where I flew in. The airport was Sheremetyevo. So my brother came there. We ordered a taxi and we drove to my dad. My dad lives in a derevnya, so it's almost like a suburb, essentially, and on the outskirts of probably the second or third ring of Moscow. And so we get there, and I remember seeing his house for the very first time. And of course, once we pulled up, the cabbie helped us out, got all of our stuff taken out, and I'm walking up to his house and I'm looking at the home, and it's a beautiful home. It's very, very big. He had a big green fence around it. It was very different. It looked very different than a typical American home. My dad comes outside, and now remember, at this point I'm 36 years old. My dad is 72 at the time. And this is the first time in my life, ever since I was a kid, since I was about 5 years old, that I'm seeing my father. And really, I think, as far as I remember, tears began to form. Tears began to stream on my face, out of my eyes. And I remember coming up and him hugging me and me hugging him, and actually thinking, wow, I mean, where do I get my height from? Because I'm about 6'2" and he's a lot shorter than me. And so, but when I saw his face right in front of me, and I couldn't help but think about the uncanny resemblance from father to son, son to father. And so this essentially ended up being my reason to why I came to Moscow for the first time. So long story short, I ended up staying there for a period of about a month. And it wasn't an easy trip by any means. But during this time, I was introduced to, through my father, to various family members that I had, up until this point, not even known existed. People who I would have never thought were even alive. I didn't know that I had any relatives or family out there. And I met cousins and aunts and nieces and nephews, and they were all such wonderful people. My dad, of course, very difficult person, but a very wise person. Difficult because he's also, had a lot of hardships in his life, namely losing his two sons. But it turned out that my father, after this whole thing happened with my mom, after, we were essentially smuggled out of the country, out of Russia, and brought her over to the United States, and forgive me because this is not, the easiest thing for me to talk about here on YouTube, because I don't know who's going to watch this, whether anyone's going to watch this or nobody at all. But really, I'm doing this for myself. I felt like I wanted to document some of this stuff, some of these thoughts that I've been having, and release them and share them with you. And maybe some of you guys may have or may not have a similar experience as to mine. But I think mine is pretty unique. And so I was in Russia at that time for a period of about a month. I was introduced to all these family members who basically welcomed me with open arms, as if we knew each other already. And I fell in love with them. I fell in love with the people that I had met there. But also, I noticed how different they were culturally from us, but at the same time how similar, and how much everything resembled America in a different way. I remember how clean the city was, how clean the streets were, how beautiful everything was, how the grass looked different. They say that, the grass is not always greener, but me going there with this fresh perspective, eyes wide open, it seemed that way. It seemed like the grass was. And the one thing I noticed is that they let the grass grow there. They don't obsess about the grass as much as they do here with keeping these perfectly manicured lawns everywhere. It wasn't like that. It was just in its natural state. Things were well kept. The streets were clean. It felt safe. And I was trying to figure out at that time how to get around, how to order a car service or an Uber or a taxi. And so my father had given me one of his apartments that he owns out there to stay in for the time that I was there. And so I did, and this was the first time I was completely on my own in Russia, which to me at that time felt like a foreign country. Even though I was born there, even though I was a citizen, I felt like a foreigner because I was raised here in the United States. I felt like an American, a Russian American, but really an American Russian visiting Russia and feeling out of place. So that was the first time that I experienced being there. And of course, a month flew by, and it was a difficult trip. The reality of things hadn't really hit me up until I got home. And so after my first trip, I get back home right in time for my daughter's birthday at the time. And the day that I landed, I had found out from a relative here in the United States that the same day that I landed, my grandmother had passed away. This was on June 6th, the day before my daughter's birthday. And I found out my grandmother had passed. She was 91 or 92 years old back in 2021. And the following day was my daughter's birthday. And so, after getting back here from Russia, this was an experience where I just couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop thinking about everything that I had experienced there, the things that I saw, the people that I've met, my father, the wisdom, the knowledge that he had shared with me, the things that I liked, the things that I didn't like, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I wanted my wife and my daughter to be able to meet my dad and my relatives over on the other side. So we began filling out forms through this Russian agency located over in Miami, so that my wife could apply for a familial 3-year visa, essentially, so that we can go to Russia together. And being that my daughter, through me, retains a Russian citizenship, even though she's an American born here, but because I'm her father, because I have a Russian citizenship, I find out that my daughter is also eligible to become a Russian passport holder. So we get all that stuff done. It takes a period of a few months to get all the paperwork sorted. We had to fly to the consulate in New York, all 3 of us, so that we can get all these documents approved and finalized. And so at the end of it all, my daughter receives a Russian Zagran passport. Basically, Russians have 2 kinds of passports that they use, as we have one. They have an external passport, which they use to fly in and out of the country, as well as they carry an internal passport within Russia as a means of identification. So my daughter receives her non-biometric passport, and we decide to book our second trip so that my father can meet my family, my wife and my daughter, and so that they can meet them. We decide to book our tickets to fly back to Moscow, the 3 of us all together. And actually this trip, the second trip now, we're flying there during the Russian winter. So this trip actually turned out to be a lot more impactful and interesting than the first, because we fly out there only a few months after my first initial visit, meeting my dad. And so this one was just on a whole nother level.